Okay, let's get to our panel. Joining us now from Shanghai is Pingkang Yu. He is Chief Economist with Changjiang Pension Insurance Company. Joining us from London is Martin Jacques. He is a Senior Fellow at the Department of Politics and International Studies at Cambridge University, and he's the author of When China Rules the World. Also with us from Hong Kong is Wong. He is Managing Director Research at the Milken Institute. And here with me in Washington is Anil Gupta, a professor at the University of Maryland. He's widely regarded as one of the world's leading thinkers on globalization and emerging economies. He also serves as chairman of the China-India Institute in Washington. Welcome to all of you to the show. Martin, let me start with you in London. 40 years of opening up and reform. What has that done for China? Not just the economy, but also Chinese society.
Well, it's utterly transformed China. I mean, if someone said in 1978 that the new reforms were going to not only transform China, but transform the world, I think there would have been very few people who would have believed you. But that is exactly what's happened. And I think that one of the critical aspects of the reform period is that it involved a very big shift in thinking. Old assumptions, old orthodoxies, old ways of thinking of socialism were, in a way, partially at least set aside. And the idea that you had to be pragmatic, that you had to seek truth from the facts, that you had to think on your feet, this was what was introduced, and I think that this was absolutely crucial to what's happened, and it created a new dynamic for China. I think one of the reasons why China is so dynamic to this day is that this unleashed an enormous intellectual energy in the country.
Pingkang Yu, China, of course, is not just stopping here. It's embarking on a new phase of reforms. We've heard President Xi promising better prospects for foreign investors, lower tariffs on vehicles, expanding imports. What can we expect in the future?
Right. Obviously, I think that this type of reform to further open up the economy will continue. But on the other hand, I think that, we cannot simplify the economic reform. I think that it at least includes two major aspects. One is I call the minus side, the other is called the plus side. The minus side, obviously, is what we call the financial deleveraging, the long process that's still going on. That's actually started from the fourth quarter of 2016 in the interbank lending market, and then happened again in the second quarter of 2017, and then, in the past month, the April 2018, we just heard that there's a introduction of this new rule on asset management industry, which is actually the off-balance sheet activities of the whole financial industry. So the point of this doing minus side is to free up these resources that has been locked up in those low efficient industry, and to move them to these places where it can be more effectively used. So, such as in this, what you call formulating the plan of Made in China 2025, mostly in manufacturing industries, the industry upgrading. And then, of course, it opened up the economy to let foreign investors further come into China, also will help up the boosting up the productivity of these industries.
Wong, we heard Martin Jacques tell us a moment ago that there was a fundamental change in thinking that got us to where China is today. What do you believe was the core thought that was changed, the core way of thinking in China that was changed, that led us to what China has become today?
I think in essence, I think probably the most important things for the Chinese as a whole to realize is everything is possible. To the Chinese people, this is quite important. And to the leadership, so it creates a very interesting dynamic. So when the Chinese people realize that everything is possible and can be achieved, they demand a lot from the government, believe it or not. So in that sense, it probably created a very interesting loop. The government, the people, how they react. So I think it's all open book. I think that's what has led to in the 40 years of reform.
Now, reform means that China is competing in a globalized economy. How important is competition for China now?
are incredibly important and probably beyond many economists' computation. That would be my assessment. Mainly, if you look at the opening up the Chinese market, might that be financial market, might that be trade? I think the key issue is not about deficit or surplus. To me, is for the Chinese consumer, and you're talking about 1.4 billion people, to get very good price for what they pay for. And that's what the trade issue is incredibly important for us in the US. But to me, it's even more important to the Chinese consumers.
Okay, let's bring it to the studio. We have with us Anil Gupta. Anil, you're an expert in emerging economies and markets. As China continues to open up, what are some of the major challenges China faces?
Yeah. So I think in terms of the reforms that China needs to do, I think it is on the right track. The question is, of course, can it be faster, and what are the challenges that China faces? So if I look at some of the major reforms, clearly that's taking place is shifting towards more consumption, shifting towards a greater focus on innovation, of course, going out in terms of rather than FDI coming into China, ODI going out of China. So if I look at all of those are taking place, the shift from state to market. But in each of these areas, there are challenges. And so, for example, if we look at the shift from investment to consumption, is that naturally, if investment is to slow down, then that would also mean that the GDP, because it has been so heavily investment driven, would slow down faster. But the moment there is any, let's say, signal that the GDP is beginning to slow down faster than the leadership might like, that the spigots get opened up a little bit. There is still a tension in terms of what dominates, or what should dominate, or what might dominate the state versus the market. If you look at innovation, clearly in terms of inputs, a lot is happening in terms of capital going into R&D, in terms of obviously the talent pool in China. But then you have, all the intellectual property issues. Right. So I think in each of these areas, in general, I would say reforms are taking place. The leadership is serious. Yeah. But could they take place faster? Probably yes.
Yeah, that issue of intellectual property rights, I want to get to that in a moment, but I want to go back to Martin. And Martin, let's look at China's place in the world right now. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, made her 11th visit to China recently. What does this tell you about China's importance in the world economy?
Well, I think it tells us a tremendous amount. Of course, Germany was far-sighted, easily the most far-sighted of any European country. From the 1980s, it really began to develop an important trading relationship with China. And Merkel's made very, very regular visits. If it's not, it must be roughly once a year. Since she took office. And I think where we are now is that there is a growing recognition worldwide that China is becoming, as it were, the economic fulcrum of the world. It is in the process of displacing the United States from this position. And every country in the world, therefore, has to think, what is our relationship going to be with China? Now, some countries are very enthusiastic about it, other countries are more reluctant. Maybe they've got reticence about dealing with China. But, whatever their position, the fact is, this is the way history is moving. And so it's like a magnetic field. For a long time, China was nowhere in this magnetic field. And then it began to move, became a more and more powerful pole in this magnetic field. And now, today, in a way, all the forces are moving to position themselves in relationship to China. There's still a long way to go, but we've come a long way already.
Pingkang Yu, China is becoming an economic powerhouse, as we've just heard, but it's not all smooth sailing. Part of becoming an economic powerhouse is that you have to face accusations of being involved in unfair trade practices, or, as Anil pointed out a moment ago, intellectual property rights and the challenges that faces. How is China addressing those issues?
Well, I think the intellectual property issue has dramatically improved in the past a couple of decades. And you know, I remember, you know, so for example, you know, maybe back 20 years ago, you can see a lot of these kind of software, you know, pirate software or CDs in some of the marketplaces, but nowadays it's completely gone. And then the reason that China has focusing on this protection of this intellectual property and also put a great effort in protection of this intellectual property because that China wants to nurture the domestic innovation as well. And now the Chinese industry, some part of the industries has already taken the leadership in certain areas. For example, the Huawei, you know, in this telecom industry, etc. In many industries, the Chinese companies already taken the lead. The reason they can take the lead is precisely because they have already have their own technical innovation. And that, I think, actually comes back to your question, previous question about this open up the economy. You know, the major benefits, one of the major benefits associated with international trade of goods and services is not the volume of the goods and services per se, but with the knowledge, the technical know-how that get transferred associated with this trade. And then when the Chinese economy has already benefited from these technological transfer or spillover effect from the world, and now the Chinese economy is taking the lead to promote this spillover effect to the world. So, for example, the establishment of this Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and the Belt and Road Initiative, etc. And so the Chinese government is putting greater effort to making investment to other parts of the world, and then associated with this international investment and trade, they were actually promoting this knowledge transfer to the other parts of the world.
Anil, on that point of intellectual property rights, what do you make of what you've just heard? And is China getting a grip on this?
I think in part yes, in part not necessarily. And so yes, of course, if we look at the last 20 years, in terms of intellectual property, there has been progress. But it's been progress much more in terms of domestic. So therefore, a domestic, you know, a Chinese company against another Chinese company, clearly there is much greater IPR enforcement. But then if we talk about foreign companies, whether it's, you know, kind of Silicon Valley or Microsoft or others from Europe and so on, therefore, you know, there is a fundamental focus on, let's say, nurturing, helping Chinese companies at quote unquote the expense of multinational companies. So therefore, that's the part which actually, you know, the US is concerned about, and other, you know, countries in Europe are beginning to be concerned about. The other thing that I would like to say is that I think China has every good, strong, justifiable reason to want to become an innovation power. If I was a Chinese, that's exactly what I would want China to do. But actually, in terms of, you know, and given, of course, China is the second largest economy, the second fastest growing economy, China will become an innovation power. But could China move faster? And I think stronger IPR enforcement vis-a-vis the multinationals would help China. And just as a one comparison point, you know, I mean, if you look at how much China invests in R&D, it's second only to the US. But then what China gets out of that R&D, you know, it's significantly much smaller portion as compared to the input of capital. If we compare China with India, China spends, according to many data points, 10 times of India actually in R&D. But in terms of the global patent applications, global patents received, that India is about half that of China. So if you look at the productivity of that R&D, it's, you know, that in China is much less. And I think weak IPR enforcement is, I think, an important part of why that is so.
Perry Wong, at the recent BOA forum in Hainan, President Xi encouraged countries around the world to, quote, and I'm quoting him here, he said, board the express train of China's economy and share benefits from its reform, opening up, and development. How much has China achieved in contributing to the health of the world economy?
Well, if you look at the number in the last 10 years, the estimate is anywhere between 15 to a quarter or sometimes even higher the GDP, global GDP growth. I think numbers sometimes, I think, may not give you the best description of the market potential lies. If you look at the past 40 years, Chinese government spent a lot of money, generations of effort. They managed to bring about 60% of people from the rural setting to the urban setting, where today we recognize the modern China. So to Chinese government, there are roughly about 45% or maybe higher number of, you would say, untouched grants. So there's much work to do. And I think that's where the slice of the pie that would drive the visits of Merkel and other global leaders to look at China to intensify relationship on trade, on transfer of technology, among other things. So it's still a long way to go. And it's a matter of how fast the Chinese government can move on. That actually is the interesting question to ask.